Imagine the year's 1840, and you're a bonny sea captain in the far South Pacific when you come upon an incomprehensibly large wall of ice. It's a mile high and stretches as far as the eye can see in each direction. So you sail to the right to see if you can find a way around it, and you sail, and no matter how far you go, it never ends. In fact, you wind up right back where you started. It is a literally impenetrable ice wall that you can never cross. Obviously, this is where the world ends, and obviously, this ice wall was built to keep us from falling off the edge of the earth, and obviously, the world is flat. Except no bonny sea captain worth his salt would have known that the earth was round in 1840. He would have known that he was traveling around in a circle. Nobody thought Antarctica was the end of the world, but in terms of accessibility, it might as well have been. Antarctica is a harsh, punishing, deadly place, next to impossible to survive. So even though the world did not end at Antarctica, it is kind of like a new world begins. There's a reason NASA trains astronauts for future Mars missions in Antarctica. It's basically another planet down there. People have only taken up residence in Antarctica in the last 100 years. It's still very much unexplored land. In the old days, unexplored lands were rife with legends and myths and speculations, dragons and whatnot, and Antarctica is no different. Today, I started looking into it, and I found a mountain of wild stories and mysteries surrounding Antarctica. So in this video, let's take a look at the single most mysterious place on planet Earth and get to the bottom of what's going on down there. If there's one word to describe Antarctica, it's desolate, an endless landscape of white snow and ice, simultaneously one of the driest places on Earth and home to 60% of the Earth's fresh water, all of it locked up in an ice sheet that covers 99.6% of the continent, a continent that's way bigger than you might think. In most map projections, you only see a little sliver of land mass at the bottom of the map, or it gets divided up in some way. But it's more than twice the size of Australia and big enough to cover the United States, Mexico, the Gulf of Mexico, and most of the southern Canadian provinces, all of it under an ice sheet that averages 2,160 meters thick, that's 1.3 miles high on average. It's also the windiest place on Earth, with an average wind speed of 10 knots, but it can reach up to 80 knots, or 96 miles an hour, due to something called katabatic winds, which are basically caused by cold, dense air being funneled through the valleys in the landscape. It's also extremely isolated, surrounded by some of the largest oceans in the world, with the mainland more than 1,000 miles away from the closest inhabited continent. The closest point is the Antarctic Peninsula, which reaches out to within 600 miles of Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, and, of course, between them is the Drake Passage, which is considered one of the roughest areas of ocean in the world because, of course, it is. Oh, it's also old and lakely. There are about 400 underground lakes in Antarctica or under ice, I guess. Scientists started finding these lakes in the 1970s using radar, seismic, and satellite technologies, and some of these are over 3 kilometers deep in the ice. Then, in the 1990s, Russian scientists discovered a lake that they called Lake Vostok. This is the 6th largest lake by volume in the world, and for some reason, it's not ice. Why is it not ice? Everything around it is ice. It turns out there's a geothermal vent down there that's warming up enough of it to keep it liquid. But again, this is the 6th largest lake on the planet, and it's under almost a mile of ice, 15-million-year-old ice. Geothermal vents, of course, are teeming with life in most places that they are found, but this particular place has been completely isolated from the rest of the world for 15 million years. There was a raging debate over what kind of sea creatures might live at the bottom of Lake Vostok for 2 decades. Scientists would get their answer in 1999, but more on that later. There is just something about us humans that when we see a place like that, remote, isolated, and deadly, we say, yeah, I'm totally going to go there. So starting in the early 20th century, it was also the site of a string of tragedies as explorers raced to be the first to the South Pole. Perhaps no explorer exemplifies the hubris of the so-called heroic age more than Robert Falcon Scott. Robert Falcon Scott, besides having an amazing name, started his career as a respected British Navy officer. But in the 1890s, both his father and younger brother died unexpectedly, which made him the lone provider for his mother and sister. So he became desperate to elevate his status, but there just weren't a lot of advancement opportunities in the Navy at the time. Then, in 1899, while home on leave, he had a chance encounter with the president of the Royal Geographical Society, a guy named Clemens Markham, who was funding an expedition to the South Pole and needed a commander. So, yeah, Robert Falcon Scott jumped at the chance. In 1901, he set sail on his ship, discovery, with fellow explorers Ernest Shackleton and Edward Wilson, and they didn't quite make it to the pole, although they did reach 82 degrees latitude, which is the furthest south anybody had ever been at that time. But yeah, they eventually had to turn back with just 530 miles to go. This was actually kind of a disaster. They ran out of supplies, the crew all came down with scurvy, and they had to resort to eating their sled dogs to survive. Still, Robert Falcon Scott wanted to press on. It was actually Shackleton who insisted that they turn back in order to save the crew. This actually led to a major falling out between the two of them that lasted for years. Still, Robert Falcon Scott returned to Britain a hero. They did cover new ground and made new geographical discoveries. There was a scientific component to this trip, so a lot of cool science was done, and to the British public, who had been kind of demoralized at this point in history, he was kind of like proof that Britain still had some fight and pluck in it. He got invited to Balmoral Castle by King Edward VII, who actually promoted him to the commander of the Royal Victorian Order. He became a toast of society for a while and eventually met and married a wealthy socialite named Kathleen Bruce. So in a way, he got exactly what he wanted from that trip, but deep down it always really bothered him that he never quite got to the South Pole, and he kind of blamed Shackleton for holding him back. And publicly, he was really nice to Shackleton, they got along and whatnot, but in practice, he was pretty antagonistic. Like in 1907, Shackleton launched his own expedition to the South Pole, and Robert Falcon Scott forbade him from landing in McMurdo Sound, which is the same place where the Discovery had landed the last time. At the time, it was by far the safest landing spot, but Scott insisted that that was his field of work, and he had the right to the area. So, yeah, he was willing to put Shackleton's whole crew in more danger because of that. Well, dude Shackleton landed there anyway on his ship, which was called the Nimrod, and they got a lot closer this time. They got to 88 degrees latitude, a mere 95 miles from the South Pole. But again, supplies ran out, dogs were eaten, and Shackleton made the decision to turn back to save his crew, which he succeeded in doing. They all made it back, barely. By the way, this would happen again to Shackleton several years later on the Endurance. You might have heard the story of the Endurance. The ship basically got destroyed in the sea ice, and he and his crew were stranded there for about 4 months before they could be rescued. But they did all survive. So while Shackleton never quite made it to the South Pole, he did earn the reputation as a captain who always put his crew first, even if it meant foregoing personal glory, something that could not be said for Robert Falcon Scott. In November 1911, the ship Terra Nova landed on Ross Island, and from there, Robert Falcon Scott set off with a crew to the South Pole, which he was going to reach this time no matter what. For once and for all, he was going to beat Shackleton, and he was going to be the first human being to the South Pole. The crew faced all the usual hardships, including sled dog stew, but they pressed on. On January 17, 1912, they did it. Robert Falcon Scott reached the South Pole, and what he found there was a Norwegian flag. Yeah, Roald Amundsen got there just a month before him, and he had no idea, at least not until he saw the flag waving there. So yeah, he and his crew turned around and headed back to their ship, which they never actually reached. One by one, they succumbed to the cold and starvation, including eventually the captain himself, and thus ended the career of Robert Falcon Scott. By the way, Roald Amundsen made getting to the South Pole look easy. Like, dude just crushed it. While everybody else had struggled and suffered and often died trying to make it, he and his crew just glided along on skis and reached the South Pole without incident. So in the wake of Scott's death, the British public turned on him, saying that he was reckless and arrogant. Robert Falcon Scott became a cautionary tale, while Amundsen became an international hero. And still today, Amundsen is remembered as the first man to reach the South Pole, while Scott is remembered for his hubris, ambition, and ultimately tragic failure. But the story doesn't end there. In a bit of irony, Scott's tragedy has given rise to some conspiracy theories regarding Antarctica. Many people claim that Scott's body was recovered and taken to a hidden base by Nazis. Yes, that was a thing. This stems from the fact that the German ship, the Schwabenland, was conducting research in Antarctica just a few years after Scott's fateful trip. The Nazis actually believed in the occult, and they were searching for remnants of a lost civilization down there, which they believed were Aryan. Others believe that Scott's failure may have triggered some sort of cover-up by the British government. It's believed that the British government still holds some secrets regarding Antarctica that they've been keeping from the public for decades. Some conspiracy theorists even believe that there are huge alien bases on the continent, despite the fact that the only thing down there is scientists trying to study climate change. If you want to go deeper into the mystique surrounding Antarctica, you'll definitely want to check out some of the urban legends surrounding the abandoned research bases down there. So, for instance, there's a base known as Vostok Station, which is actually the one that was built closest to Lake Vostok. It's only a temporary station. It was established in 1955 and has been occupied since 1983. However, it is now completely abandoned, and nobody seems to know what happened to the scientists who once worked there. There are a few stories about this, including the eerie notion that they all just disappeared one day without a trace. Others say they were abducted by aliens, and there are those who insist that they came into contact with something terrifying beneath the ice, something that may have been awakened by their presence. As far as we can tell, this is just speculation and urban legend, but it's fun to consider the possibilities of what may lurk beneath the ice of Antarctica, especially if there are vast underwater ecosystems that have never been discovered or mapped out before. Then there's also the story of the Antarctica.